organizations they know about, or do I have? For the survey afterwards?
Yeah, you didn't have a specific
No.
one, right? Just our general one. Yep. Oh, no, I don't have. Well, it's relatively black here, and I really. I'm sure it will. It smells really good. Yeah.
Or do you guys want to do more of a, turn it back into like theater style? Are you sure? Okay, because I know some people's backs are.
Are you able to talk after that game last night?
So,
I thought maybe you went up a voice.
so here's the thing. Now with my son, I can't yell that late. And I knew it wasn't gonna start until like closer to 9 o'clock.
No.
So I had donated some tickets to like this summer raffle last summer. And the person who got it, because of the fun game, my husband was so angry. He's like, "No, you got away." And I was like, okay. Please turn around. Yeah, we're gonna 11:30. Yeah. If you look at this, and I like on Thursday. I'm like, you know, yeah.
Good to see you. He's in rehab now. And
How long were you there?
Oh, yeah. It's hard.
so he got diagnosed with multiple myeloma.
Like this.
And
Well, it's cold out right now. I bet a lot of people.
So.
Sarah, Taylor, love that sweater.
He's 6 years older than me.
It's everyone today.
So he was coming back home and this weird.
I know Simon's out today. Jamie's out.
The rash, not so much, but the back.
Yeah, I lost my leg. Have you seen Maria? I've seen her today. You saw her today?
Yeah.
So that's.
Oh, Maria's upstairs? Okay, there's Janetta. There's Julie. Aretha, or Priya. I don't see Priya. Is that one wrong? I'm 12:57. Gotcha. Let's see. Harry.
Yeah, well, he's in rehab.
She will be behind, but will probably be
Yes, again. He
Where?
works at Lowe's.
Partner in crime.
So.
She's going hours behind. She'll be on her way back here. I don't know, I'll text her.
Oh, no, it's fine. I was just,
So.
like, did they text her? Are there other people that are here besides Simon and Jamie?
Yeah, so.
Erica? Oh, Erica had an interview today. That's right. Oh, there's more friends. Hi, friends.
Yeah.
I think Mary has an interview.
Mary did too. Yep. Yeah, Mary had an interview.
Well, I guess when you go home.
Interview, six.
Can I do
interview.
a non-snowy mountain resort?
Don't really.
A non-snowy?
Oh, sure.
It doesn't
What's
matter.
the, what's the third
Outside.
option?
Oh,
It can just be mountains, but like warm.
I did. Or my bed. Or my bed. I'm like, yeah. We're gonna do it.
And you know, I was really good at afraid.
Why, why one?
Yeah, and it was yes, if he didn't. So I, because I taught at Xavier. and I was supposed to be-
Yeah, that's so nice. And
I was good at it. You just keep your personality. But. I couldn't be a other.
They can, yeah, they can. Sarah, is our speaker working today?
Great, okay.
Woo. Hey, everybody, make sure to use your name tents, especially on the days that we have folks that are not as familiar with our class.
Yeah. For sure.
Awesome.
Speaking of, I'm doing it.
People have some folks
I
She got it all right there. Yeah, the go-to points that are clinical counselors, social workers for CEUs, and then some of our lunch trainees for various reasons as well. Will there be any breakout rooms? Okay, no worries. So we're all good.
All right, welcome back to our first core course of 2024. We always love to kick off this semester with Kimberly Rotundo. She is a long-standing partner and collaborator with the LEND program, was on our core faculty for a long time when she worked here at Cincinnati Children. And now she has her own educational consulting company. And it comes back and just, this is a great opportunity for us to start the second semester with all grounding ourselves in understanding special education law, all things acronym related to education, and kind of leaning in towards this course. We kind of talked about early childhood last semester, talked about early preschool and early intervention and things, and now we're moving into more school age issues and things of that nature. And by the end, we're talking about employment and what happens when school stops for our individuals. So we have a mic back there, maybe? Is there a mic somewhere? Okay, great. Make sure you use that for the folks in Zoom land, and people in Zoom land, feel free to just come off mute and shout out if you have a question. Because it's just easier that way for the speaker in the room than raising your hand. So. Anything else? Any questions you all have for us before we get started? Awesome, great.
Hi, it's nice to meet you all.
I gotta work for you.
Good, good.
Oh, wait, you know what? I thought I messed it up. Now it will work for you. There you go.
Thank you,
Yeah.
thank you. Well, it's nice to see you all, and I always appreciate coming back to Children's and especially the LEND program. I was an educator here at Children's for over 30 years, and the last couple of years have been in private practice. So I'm really excited to be here and to tell you what I know. My family likes to call me the grandmother of special education. When the special education law passed, that was the year that I started at college. So I knew, the law from the very beginning when we were trying to figure it out and navigate our way through there. How many of you are currently working in schools? Anybody? Oh, good. And what's your discipline?
Social work.
Your social work. Got it. Anybody else working? Yeah. What are you all?
Language.
Speech and language? Yeah. What schools are you in?
Taylor Elementary.
Taylor, over in Kentucky? The Taylor here. Okay. And you
Multilingual Academy
say again?
Avenue, Multilingual Academy.
Oh, yes, the Multilingual Academy. And where are you?
Riverside.
Side. Got it, got it. Well, great. Well, I certainly welcome any comments and questions along the way. I'll kind of give you an overview. What I'm trying to explain to you about special education is from the federal law. We will talk a little bit about the state laws and how they impact this and how they are influenced by the federal law. Some you may find in working with some schools that some may not follow the letter of the law in the same way, but I'm trying to give you a basic overview that has been pretty accepted over the years that I've been giving this program about what the law would expect from you. My website and my contact information is there. If there's no time at the end, and you want to shoot me an email about any questions you might have or specifics you might have, I'm more than glad to answer them. So thank you for having me here. So let's talk about special education. There are three main things that I'd like to really talk about today. I want to talk about the laws and the practices and how they really influence children in education. I want to talk about the special education process and what people have to go through to get an IEP, to get a 504 plan, to get the supports that they need within a school, even private schools. And then I want to talk a little bit about, since right now you're in a clinical setting, a little bit about how the clinical setting and the educational setting sort of work together and sometimes don't always work together. And so we want to put together that dream team of finding a way to making us all work together. Again, I want to let you know if you have a comment or a question about something, I am more than glad to pause, and feedback is certainly appreciated. I have a lot of content they want me to cover, but I certainly want to address your concerns as they come up. So let's start out with the laws and the practices. What laws do you know about that affect kids in school? You know any laws? Yeah. IDEA, you know what that stands for? Anybody? You know it?
Individuals with Disabilities Education.
You got it. What's your discipline?
I'm in audiology.
Audiology. So you've worked in some of the schools?
I haven't worked in a mainstream school. I've worked in a school for the deaf
For
before.
the deaf. Great, great. Yeah, so IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and it's actually IDEA now, which is Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act, but it doesn't go by that very often. Any other laws you know about that affect education? What about the Civil Rights Act? There's a part of the Civil Rights Act that addresses education. You know what that part is? Well, good. So maybe we'll learn something new today. So let's talk a little bit about the timeline of education. I'm old, but I'm not this old. All right, so I'm going to take you back to 1918. 1918, can you believe this country was founded in 1776? But it wasn't until 1918 that the Supreme Court mandated public education in this country. That didn't mean that there wasn't public education. It just wasn't mandated. But in 1918, it was mandated, and it was mandated first grade through 8th grade. So it's not been that long of a period of time that we've had education laws and education interactions in this country that's been so formalized. You know, there wasn't a whole lot that went on until the early 1960s. And you all know from studying your history about the 1960s and the Civil Rights Act and how we were working to make this country more accessible to everyone who lived in the country. You'll see after the Civil Rights Act, we had families who were saying, you know, now we've got education opened to the mainstream public, but not to persons with disabilities. And so in 1975, and that's when I started off into college, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act was passed. And then this went into becoming IDEA. Since that period of time, we've of course got the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is a part of the Rehabilitation Act. And then we have No Child Left Behind, one of the worst laws I think ever passed, but I got to tell you, I'm one of those kind of speakers that'll tell you how I feel about things. So, and I'll tell you why I don't like it when we start talking about that. And then of course there was the Common Core, which a lot of parents don't like because they don't understand math in Common Core, but we got the Common Core kind of law. Then we had Race to the Top for a while under President Obama, where we were trying to pull our education system back up out of where it had fallen below most of the other developed countries. And currently we are functioning under ESSA, which is Every Student Succeeds Act. So the current education law is called ESSA, or Every Student Succeeds. If you're working in Ohio, and there is a Taylor School in Kentucky. That's why I ask. So, so there are several. There's several St. John the Baptist in Kentucky, Indiana, and Ohio. So if you tell me you're working there, I'm going to say where. But Every Student Succeeds Act is the federal law, and then in the state of Ohio, we have the 3rd grade reading guarantee. Anybody familiar with that? Oh, you are. How do we feel about it? Good, I'm seeing some negative shaking of heads here. How about you? Yeah, maybe not an opinion yet. We'll try and get you an opinion soon, all right? So we got the third grade reading guarantee. Let's start out with Every Student Succeeds Act. So the Every Student Succeeds Act has currently changed education to where education used to be focused more at a federal level. They would tell the states the various things that needed to be done. And what they've done is they've listened to the people in the states and said, now the states are going to do more of their own governing and are just going to be responsible to reporting the governing of how they manage education back to the federal level. The federal level is going to start investigating policy, and it's going to start using research to influence the way education is conducted in various states. It will also provide more money for professional development. The federal level before of education was only addressing the needs of the students and not the teachers or the other professionals who were working within the school system. And so what ESSA does is it actually has a period, part of its finances are going to be ferreted into professional development. And as I said, research and development is another big area that Every Student Succeeds Act is starting to put a focus. And of course, the focus from the federal level is primarily finances or money to be able to address these kinds of things. Some of the things ESSA set out to do was really to advance equity. In our country, each state runs their own education system. In fact, in some states, like Ohio, there are various school districts throughout there who manage many of their own things. They work under the label of the state, but they manage their own curriculums. They choose their own materials. I think this is something we'll talk about as we move along here to whether that's the best way to perform education. But what ESSA tried to do was say, let's put more of a blanket, let's put more of an umbrella over education in this country, because our country has become not just diverse, but we are very much a society where we move, children can move up to 6 or 7 times during their 12-year or 13-year school setting. And so how we can make an umbrella to cover them so that we can support their learning in the developmentally appropriate ways, no matter where they're living. It also does more to look at technology. What ESSA is starting to do is, when I first started out working with Lind, we knew that books on tape were helpful for kids who had reading disabilities, but not all school districts had funds to purchase books on tape. And so what ESSA is trying to do is to put more into the research, development, assistive technology so that every school district can have access to the types of materials that children need to be able to learn. The third grade reading guarantee. Whenever politics gets involved in anything, but especially education, it tends to muddy the water a little bit. So let's talk a little bit about education. I really think special education started thanks to President Kennedy. You may have heard about President Kennedy. There's a whole new investigation of how he was assassinated and everything, even though it's been many, many years since that happened. But when he became president, you may not know, but his family member, his oldest sister, was a person with a disability. And probably she had mild cognitive impairment, or what they called at that time, mental retardation, mild mental retardation. Maybe, we're not even sure of that. But she wasn't allowed to go to school. Now, this was a very big, wealthy family, and all of their kids, it was very important for them to all go to school. But this one sister was kicked out of school and kind of told she couldn't. She may have had an emotional disturbance. We're not really sure what went on. But does anybody know what the therapy was in the 30s and 40s that they did for children who weren't learning or weren't behaving correct? What was the therapy? Lobotomy. Lobotomy was done. They performed a lobotomy on President Kennedy's sister, and she became significantly impaired. So much so that she lived the rest of her life in a nursing home, and lost most of the ability to walk and some of the ability to talk. That was the treatment that they had for children, even with mild cognitive impairments or some mild physical disabilities. That was what we thought needed to be done at that time. President Kennedy was given a book. It's a book called Christmas in Purgatory when he first was elected president. And what happened was this man went around to all the institutions around in the country, or many of them in the country, and took pictures of what was happening in these institutions. Because not only would your person, your child with disabilities, be possibly given a lobotomy, but because there were no resources, there were no wheelchairs at home, there were no resources in schools, most of those children lived in residential settings for the majority of their life. And so he went around to these residential settings and he took pictures of them. And he put together this book, which had very little words in it, but all these pictures, and he called it Christmas in Purgatory, meaning that it was like hell for these children. Many times they were left with no clothes, they were toilet trained, they were not given an opportunity to learn to read or to socialize or to even leave these areas. Somebody gave a copy of that book to President Kennedy, and he put together the very first group to look at mental retardation in this country, and that's what it was called. He put together the Council on Mental Retardation. And you may know that another one of his sisters actually started the Special Olympics. So they were very much a family who recognized the needs, special needs of children, and how we needed to make sure that not only did we address the inequities of children of color in this country who weren't given equal access to education, but children with disabilities who were not being given equal access. And that all came about, I think, because of President Kennedy. Well, as you might know, when politics get involved, there's one side of the aisle that does one thing and one side of the aisle that does another. And during the period of time that we're talking about with this third grade reading guarantee, most of the Republican agenda was toward putting in evaluation measures, proficiency tests as a part of No Child Left Behind to make sure children were learning. Those of us who have been school teachers for years were a little bit set back thinking that, what the policies being put in were that testing was going to evaluate whether we were doing our job. And, we felt like we probably were, but maybe not everybody, but we probably were. But the Republicans were like, we want to prove that education is being done well in this country. And the Democrats were more with, okay, what we think needs to happen is we need to have a more blanketed education system. Instead of having one system of teaching reading in Cincinnati Public School and one in Taylor School and one in another school and a different kind of reading instruction or math instruction in all these different schools. What happened was the governor of Ohio was a Republican. And he believed that the Common Core of putting together a Common Core for the state of Ohio was good. That went against his party. His party did not believe in the Common Core. And so to kind of balance out what was going on, he said, I want the Common Core to be in the state of Ohio. I want all the counties to be teaching reading through phonics in 1st through 3rd grade. I want 3rd through 5th grade to be where we emphasize social studies and sciences. So he appreciated the Common Core, or this umbrella education, but to sort of appease his party, he also felt that we needed to put some tests in place to make sure that kids were reading on grade level by 3rd grade. This was devastating. The first year that this law came out, we had to hire in the state more than 700 3rd grade teachers, because what happened was if the child didn't pass this 3rd grade reading guarantee, they were retained to 3rd grade. It didn't matter whether they had straight A's, it didn't matter whether they were doing everything else, they were retained to 3rd grade. And this happened for a few years. Many of us and many of Len students who were working here at the time would go with me to the state education offices and fight this and say, these children don't need to be retained. We're punishing them because they're not performing well on a single test. Well, then they expanded the test. And now this 3rd grade reading guarantee is given in 2nd grade and 3rd grade. So children have 3 opportunities to pass this computer-based test. Now, do you think looking at things on a computer is the best way to evaluate reading? Well, I'm a reading teacher, so I've got to tell you, I like to hear kids read, to see if they can decode, to ask them questions. But the third grade reading guarantee is a computerized test. It's online and the kids take the test. We all know that kids are familiar now with just hitting the button and going ahead because so many programs self-correct themselves. So I think many kids are not doing as well on this third grade reading guarantee because they're not appreciating what's happening if they don't pass that. No longer do children have to be retained to third grade if they don't pass the third grade reading guarantee. Now they're given 3 opportunities to take the test. If they don't pass the test, they can go through a 2-week summer program where they address reading, and then a teacher listens to them read and decides, are they on track and they're just not demonstrating it through this test, or do they really need some other kinds of interventions? And now in almost all schools, they're not retained to third grade, but they go back to third grade for more reading instruction while doing the other areas of fourth grade. Does that make sense? Any other comments or questions about that third grade reading guarantee? I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time in it. I think that there are lots of things that you need to know about that. Parents need to be notified every time the kids take the test to see if they're doing all right. If a child has English as a second language, they're not held to this third grade reading guarantee for the first 3 years that they're introduced into English, because so many of them were English as a second language learners who were performing poorly on this test because English just was not their primary language. And children who already have IEPs have the opportunity to be exempt from this third grade reading guarantee. But I think if you're working in the state of Ohio, you need to understand the third grade reading guarantee, the consequences of it. Yes. She needs the microphone.
Wasn't some of the controversy though as well that it's one standard for all school districts? So not every school district has the resources or the parental support, but it's a standard across the state that everyone
It's
has to
one
meet
standard
regardless
test
of
for the
your
whole
socioeconomic.
for the whole state.
Right,
Yes.
yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That was another controversy, right?
You're
Because
exactly
they were
right.
holding them back.
Bigger controversy than just the third grade reading guarantee.
Yeah.
That looks at all the proficiency testing because we don't have a national curriculum in this country. All the other countries, England, Switzerland, China, I mean, all the other developed countries in the entire world have what they call a national curriculum. So everybody is taught a certain reading methodology at first grade, a math methodology at second grade. The United States is very different.
And didn't it also go against the performance for the schools as far as getting their funding too? If they couldn't pass those kids in third grade, then the districts didn't get the money.
In fact, some of my teacher friends actually lost their jobs because if a certain portion of your class did not pass it, your teaching license.
So with this new version of, my kids lived through that first phase of it. So this next phase though, are you still at risk as a teacher for not having that performing, or you're given more chances to pass them, or?
Supposed to be. In fact, they will tell you that you weren't supposed to be held at that criteria
But
all
they did.
along,
But
but
they
we
did.
saw that it
Right.
was. And schools, you're exactly right. Underperforming schools were given less funds. Can you imagine that? If it's an underperforming schools, we're gonna give them less money because we're gonna punish them with money. And that's where I say when legislature gets involved in educational decisions, really makes for a very difficult and challenging way to navigate things. Thank you for that. You're exactly right. Let's talk a little bit, about the John Peterson Scholarship. It's not really a law, but it's kind of something that influences education. This is scholarships or money that for kids who are going through kindergarten through 12th grade and they have an IEP, that money, that scholarship money can be given to the families or the schools to provide additional supports. Everything from speech therapy, occupational therapy, to even attending a school that may be better aligned to the disability that the child has. So this is something else that you might be interested in as far as what influences education. Then, of course, there's the Ed Choice Scholarship. And this again is another part of the agenda of a political party, which is providing vouchers to families to decide what school they wish to have their children attend, and paying a certain amount of public funds for education to private schools if parents choose to send their children to a private school. I'm not gonna comment much more on that because I think you can tell that I'm not real happy about this kind of thing. You know, it's really, public education doesn't get enough funding, in my opinion, to begin with. And now some of that public funding is now going to people choosing. And my daughter actually happens to work at Moeller High School, which is a parochial high school in Cincinnati. And every student that goes there now is getting a little less than $8,500 to go to school there to help them with tuition, which I appreciate as a parent who's had to pay tuition, who's had to pay therapies. I appreciate how expensive it is, but this is now all coming from the one fund that, how is education funded in this country? Almost every state, you know? Property taxes, that's right, property taxes. And so property taxes are what is how they get the money to purchase the schools and the curriculums. Yes.
Sorry, I was gonna jump into the other.
That's all right.
The other controversy on that is that you have families that are in, like my kids are in Forest Hills schools, and we have a great public school system, but we have people that choose the private, so they use the waiver money, even though they could certainly
Stay in a good
stay in a
school
good school. Yeah, so it does kind of take away from so that's part of the other pitch.
Yeah, she said that, not me. Don't rate me low for that. But I agree. I agree. That's what I was trying to say. I was trying to be politically correct here. Yeah. But you have to think about, there is a pool of money and how are you going to allocate this? And currently there is the Ed Choice Scholarship in Ohio and in many other states where the belief is that parents should have the right to choose the schools they want their children to go to, and the government should help fund those decisions. But let's go back to special education. So those are all the kinds of things that are influencing education. Let's talk about the Civil Rights Act. And Section 504 is the part of the Civil Rights Act, or the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, that really helps children with disabilities that may not be identified educationally, but they may have a broader disability. We'll talk a little bit about that idea, or the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act, and then just a little bit about No Child Left Behind, because I can't let that go. So let's talk a little bit about how education law is set up. So there's civil law, that's the Civil Rights Act. And then there's education law, all right? It's not enough to have one governing body. We gotta have two separate governing bodies to govern what's happening with education. So let's start out by looking at the civil law. You may remember that in the 50s and 60s, children of color in the South were not welcomed into the schools. There were separate schools for those children. I will tell you that I grew up in Miami, Florida, but I was trained and educated in Southern Georgia. And that was in the mid to late 70s. And for children with disabilities, we were actually housing them, because we weren't mainstreaming them or including them at the time. We were actually housing them in the old schools that were built for children of color. And they were built in very rural areas. They were poorly constructed. Actually, my first classroom out of college was held where they keep the lawnmowers back in the back of a school. There was a shed where they kept the lawnmowers. And they put a curtain there, and I had my 10 special ed students that were right across from there. It's amazing that we all don't have like lead poisoning from the smell of the lead gasoline that we were breathing in. But the civil law was put into place to say that everybody deserved the right to an education. In 1954, the Supreme Court passed Brown versus the Board of Education, which said it bans segregation in public schools. If you've read about history or you've ever traveled to other parts of the country, you know that that ruling wasn't put into place in many places until 60s and the early 70s. But the Supreme Court said we can't have separate but equal. Prior to this, children of color went to one school in the South and the white children went to another. And that was considered separate but equal. that as long as they were giving an education, it was considered okay. Brown versus the Board of Education said, no, 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 no. Now, everybody gets the same education in the same setting and a ban segregation in the public schools. By 1964, and you can look, 8-10 years have passed by, the Civil Rights Act was finally passed. So it put meat to Brown versus the Board of Education and started the whole thing of prohibiting the exclusion of persons of color from voting, from school, from any kind of using public services. Section 504 of this law said it empowered individuals with disabilities so that they could have the utmost maximum of employment and education. It wasn't what we see now. It wasn't the IEPs. That's going to be an education law. This was making sure that the accommodations and supports for children with disabilities were available for children in public schools. And this is what President Kennedy said. He pushed to get the Civil Rights Act passed, but of course was assassinated prior to the passing of that, but wanted everyone to have an equal opportunity to go to school. He felt that if his sister had been given that, and by then lobotomy had sort of lost favor in the country and we weren't doing that to children with disabilities anymore, he wanted to make sure that they had the opportunity to go to school and to have the sort of dignity that now we are emerging to give persons with disabilities. Section 504 also identifies modifications and accommodations that equal the playing field. So what Section 504 does is it equals the playing field. Let me give you an example of how this works. So I myself have 2 children. Both of my children have something called Island's disease. It's a mouthful. Are the physical therapists here? Physical therapists probably know about this. It's like a malformation of the way the foot and the ankle develop. And it really resolves itself when kids' bones start going together and they don't break their feet as much. But growing up, my children were in casts 24/7. I have dance recital pictures of my children in casts because they were allowed to have dance recitals and go to dance because of 504 plans. But they still had to wear their casts because of the condition they had. So my oldest daughter wanted to be a physician, and in the school district where we were, you had to pass a test to go to what they now call STEM schools or STEAM schools. We didn't call them that back then. They were gifted programs or whatever. She had to pass this test to get into this school that had high science instruction. She passed it with flying colors. Actually, I'm not just a mom blowing my horn. She scored second highest of anybody that had ever taken the test. So she gets on the school bus to go to 9th grade, to go to this separate school. They housed this special program in a school that was built in 1935. All of the science activities were on the 6th floor of this building because it didn't have good fire stuff. And they wanted all of the stuff, the exploratory stuff to be on the top floor. Well, of course, the very first day that she goes to school, she's in 2 casts on her legs. It was very common for us. I mean, she spent most of her childhood in casts, but she gets on the bus and she gets to this new school and the principal meets her at the bus and says, I'm sorry, we're sending you back to the regular school. We have no elevator in this school. We have no way to get you up to the 6th floor. I don't have any way of doing this. You can't come to this school. My daughter, when she came home off the bus that day, you can imagine when she got off the bus, I said, how was that program? How exciting is that kind of program? And my daughter just broke down and said, they said I can't go there. I said, well, clearly they don't know what a 504 plan is. They don't know the Rehabilitation Act or the Civil Rights Act because, honey, you're going there. And so I got on the phone and I called the principal and I said, she has a 504 plan. You have to make it available to her. I don't know how you're going to do it. I can't believe you haven't had to address this before, but you got to find a way. She passed the intake. As long as she passed the requirements to get into that program, she has to get there. Well, the principal said, I don't know what we're going to do. So I called the state And just to kind of let you know, the state then sent down a science trailer that they put beside that school. And they used to call it the Rotundo trailer because my daughter, that was her name. And means round and fat, but that's my husband's name. I just happened to think. But anyway, and then I decided to look like it so nobody could forget it. That's a whole nother discussion. But they brought down this trailer that they set beside there until they tore down this school, which was just in the last 5 or 6 years. That trailer sat there all those years so that other kids with disabilities had access and opportunity to the same program. So that's what a 504 plan is. Those of you who are working with children, maybe children who break their arm or get a broken leg, or maybe they play sports and they get a concussion. All of those kinds of things can be make a child eligible for a 504 plan. So if a child gets a concussion and they put a 504 plan in place, they may not have to do the same amount of homework, or their test grades may be modified because they have difficulty concentrating, or whatever may occur based on the kind of disability that the child has. So it doesn't have to be cognitive impairment or autism or any of those kind of things that are going to qualify a kid for an IEP. It can be the kinds of things that we typically see day to day that children have that can get 504 plans. This is one of the most underutilized supports in schools. It's underutilized for 2 reasons. Number one is there is no federal funding that goes directly to 504 plans. We'll talk in a minute about IEPs. There is federal funding that matches IEPs. There's no federal funding that goes to 504 plans. But just like when I called the state and asked for a science trailer to come down, there are federal funds to support the education system when they can't have access, when children can't have access. That's a requirement. That's what the Civil Rights Act said we were going to do. Make sure that everybody had equal access and opportunity to public education. Questions about 504 plans? Yep. That's right.
Obviously like the old mother here, but the 504s in my experience too are also highly utilized for like learning disabilities, for extended test timing and special environments and stuff. So people that don't have typically like a physical disability or a concussion or something like that can utilize a 504 plan, I think.
Yes, but so can children with learning disabilities.
Well, that's what I'm saying, with the learning disabilities, but it's a higher bar for a learning disability to get an IEP. So it's an easier road to get the 504, but
It can, but I would say if a child is diagnosed with a learning disability, I would fight for an IEP.
right, it's a higher bar with the school to get them to give you that IEP. The 504 is generally the path of least
The easiest,
resistance.
yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Least.
Right. And then I think that you also run into with some of the students that are cognitively, like there's a stigma to the 504. And so it's also underutilized. And I know friends who've had kids who 504s extend even into college environments as well. And they don't want to be separated or called out for it, which is ridiculous because it's a gift to be able to get that extra help. But that is another stigma to it. That
I agree with you. And I don't know why it's such a stigma, because I work with children all the time to explain to them, this is your right. It's your right to have the environment set up so that you can demonstrate your abilities. And she's exactly right. A 504 plan can cover you when you get a job, when you go to college, where an IEP, which we'll talk about next, will not do that. It ends upon 12th grade or completion of your 22nd year if you're a person with a cognitive impairment. Thank you. Very good. Yeah. You know, 504 plans don't have the same restrictions or responsibilities for forms. You know, IEPs have this certain federal form that has to be filled out. 504 plans, many schools determine for themselves what a 504 plan will look like. There's so many online. So if you're interested in them, you know, just search for 504 plans and you'll see. What it primarily does is it lists what the accommodation is and who's going to be responsible for making sure that happens. So it's not going to be where they take a child's reading and develop their reading skills to the next level. It's where they make sure that everything that's there. So if a child is blind and can't access the written materials, a 504 plan would say that child has to have Braille, or that child has to have books on tapes. Those are the accommodations that are put into place. So that's what a 504 plan is. 504 plans and the Rehabilitation Act is now a part of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So you may know those cutouts in the streets, you know, the braille in the elevators, all of those kinds of things came about as a result of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the 504 plan falls under that. So anything that is a law under the Americans with Disabilities is also something that can be captured in a 504. Great. I like what the Americans with Disabilities Act did. It actually defined disability. Now, we may have differences of opinion of, is this the best definition of disability? But it's a very broad definition of disability, which is why it allows so many different children to be able to capture these 504 plans. Disability applies to individuals with any sort of physical or mental impairment that affects their ability to perform normal life activities, going to school, walking in the neighborhood, any of the kinds of activity, breathing, walking, talking, any of those kinds of things can be covered by that. We're seeing a real insurgence of children now having some difficulties with mental health, are really finding benefit to 504 plans as a way of making sure the environment is comfortable and safe for these children with mental health problems. So it's a very broad definition of disability. You'll see when we talk about IEPs, disability is defined very strategically. You know exactly what the disability is in an IEP versus an American with Disabilities or 504 plan. Any questions or thoughts about that? So let's take it to the next level and look at education law. Now, it's important that you understand they're governed by two different legal entities. If you feel like my daughter was being denied access to a school because she had a physical disability, then you hire a lawyer, a civil rights attorney, and you go through the court systems to do this. If you have an IEP, a lot of families have frustrations with IEPs, and we'll discuss lots of things that can come up that can frustrate you with getting an IEP, maintaining an IEP, those sorts of things. Some of it, I think, is because the law is not completely understood by families, teachers, school districts. I was just talking with a colleague that I worked with before, and she said, you know, when the law is passed, it takes 5 to 7 years for it to get down to where people can really understand how that is operationalized in the school district. And that's really very true. But if you're not happy with what's going on in the schools, there are attorneys who consider themselves to be educational law attorneys who will fight on your behalf for this service that you're asking for. But the law also says that if you hire an attorney to fight an IEP, to fight this educational law, and you lose, then you're responsible for paying the attorney fees of the school district. 92% of families who get an attorney and go through the traditional court systems lose. And I think that's because they don't understand the law and what it is meant to do. Where the Civil Rights Act gives equal opportunity, the education law is set there to help children that are specifically identified with a disability to improve their performance in school. It's not always looked that way in the legal system. And so I often tell families who come to my private practice, don't hire an attorney. I'm a lot cheaper, you know, and I will help you navigate what's going on in school. I can't promise you I'll win, but I can help you navigate those things because I understand the law and how the law is implemented in the school system. Doesn't mean you can't get an attorney, but I often tell families, unless you're very wealthy and you want to throw money around, you know, maybe if they're breaking the Civil Rights Act, if they're not giving you access or opportunity to go to a certain school and you've passed all the criteria for that, then you get an attorney. But otherwise, you need someone who's an education expert to help you navigate IEPs. So let's talk about IEPs. So remember, in 1918 was when that Compulsory Education Act passed. And then it wasn't until 1975 when that Education for All Handicapped Children passed. And this was the law that said we've got to put some meat in education that will make sure that these children are getting the type of education that they deserve, all right? Not just that they're allowed to go in the schools, because remember the Civil Rights Act said everybody had to have access and opportunity. But what these parents wanted and what educators wanted was not just that children could sit in the same classroom with children that learned in a typical fashion, but they were given the kind of instructional methodology that allowed them to improve their skills to the best of their ability. And that's what the Education for All Handicapped Children Act did, and what IDEA struggles to do. I put No Child Left Behind on there because we're going to talk about what it did. And it really wasn't the positive things that the other laws have done, in my opinion. So again, that 1975 public law said everybody gets a free and appropriate public education, okay? It's not just access, it's an appropriate education. I will tell you, when I was in, I think I was in the 4th grade, and I was living in outside of Miami, Florida. And at that time, at which you can imagine it was in the 60s, and so we were still dealing with the repercussions of the Civil Rights Act, of making sure that everybody got opportunities. There was an Indian reservation that was in the area near where I lived. And these children did not speak English, and they all went to their Indian schools. And as a part of the Civil Rights Act, they then were given opportunity to come to the regular public school. And I can remember my 3rd grade teacher telling us that this boy from the Indian reservation was going to start coming to our school, and that he couldn't speak English. He didn't dress like the rest of us. She didn't think he was clean. And she said, I'm going to put him in the back of the room, and I'm going to give him crayons and coloring books. Stay away from him. That's exactly what she told us as 3rd graders, which is why my mother said I was either going to become a tremendous criminal, or I was going to fight this special education thing, you know, to make sure that everybody got opportunity. What I did was, and I don't know why I did this, but he came into our classroom, and I would steal chalk off the chalkboard. That was back when we had chalk and chalkboard. I stole it, and I took it out on the playground, and I taught him his ABCs, or I tried to teach him his ABCs and to write his name. Would you believe I got expelled for 3 days for breaking that rule? Because the teacher had said we weren't allowed to play with him, and that was okay. Can you imagine that happening today? So what family said in 1975, when I graduated from high school and started going to college, was, we're not going to do that anymore. These children who now have access to schools need opportunities. They need an appropriate education. That 3rd grade teacher should have been teaching him English. She should have been teaching him the letters instead of giving him a coloring book and putting him in the back of the school. But that is actually what happened. So Public Law 94-142 came about. We started doing all this testing to evaluate children, to find out where their deficiencies were and where their strengths were. And then making sure their education program fit under the umbrella of education, but targeted specific weaknesses and strengths that we could capitalize on to make these children more effective in the education setting. As I said, that law then has been changed several times, and the last time was in 2004 with the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act. So side by side, do you see the 2 laws? The Civil Rights Act, Section 504, allows equal access and opportunity, and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act allows for free and appropriate public education. But they have to go through certain kinds of testings and evaluations and criteria to receive that appropriate education. Any questions or comments about those 2 key laws that I think you have to understand to make sure when you're advocating for children in schools that you're advocating under the correct area to make sure you give children the kind of supports they need? Yes.
So say if that scenario that you just explained where the child was sitting in the back of the classroom with the coloring book happened today, what would be the course of action to make sure that's not happening? Would it be the Civil Rights Act, or would it be
It was
Okay.
the Individuals with Disabilities Act, because that
Okay.
child was coming into the education system without language, without
Mhm.
So I would think that we would have to do a full evaluation to see what kind of English, how much English they knew, and then how we were going to address that. So I
Okay.
think they'd be more aligned to getting that. I think if you have a child who was like that, but did have some English or had been exposed to the education system before, that was the first time he'd ever been in school. He'd never even been in school. I think that could be a 504 plan. You know, sometimes you get children who English is a second language, but they have a fair amount of English and really just need some clarification. They might do a 504 plan, but for the most part, that child would need to be evaluated.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure, good questions. Other questions or comments about that? Remember that I told you there's really not a lot of money in the Civil Rights Act for individuals or for schools specifically. It's more to make sure that the environment is equal and the opportunity is equal. There is federal funding under IDEA. So when a child gets an IEP, they send that IEP to the state level, and then the state compiles all of them, sends it to the federal level, and there are matching funds that come down from the federal level and the state level that come down to educate children. Now, some people think, and some families have been frustrated, thinking that that pool of money that comes for individuals go directly to that individual, and it doesn't. The money that comes from the federal government and the state government is there to support children with disabilities, but it doesn't follow the child from one grade or one setting to another. And that's somewhat frustrating for families. And it used to be more frustrating when schools would say, well, we'd love to give your child books on tape, but our school district doesn't have the funds to buy books on tape, and so we can't do it. And then families would say, well, wait a minute, you're getting all this money from the federal government and from the state, and you can't purchase these kinds. I don't think we see that as much, but you may tell me that we do.
No,
Yeah.
I'm
So full disclosure, my son had an IEP, but don't you think I think it's the terminology, it's that individualized education that if they change the language, it would make it better because you feel like you're getting this individualized plan for your child but your hours are shared with other students. I mean, it gets very complicated and very muddy, but I think you've got this great gift from the state and it is helpful. I don't know that it's a great gift and it is not individualized.
Well, the
Right.
goals are
Goals are
individualized.
individualized,
That you're trying to reach
Right.
are
but
individualized.
how you
But the
get there, the services are not individualized. So I think that that's part of the confusion because as a
Correct.
mother who doesn't understand it, I mean, I understood it. I got up to speed pretty quickly, but like I did have friends who hired lawyers and took them to their IEP meetings. I never did.
And it
because
wasn't beneficial
It was
because,
not beneficial and they ended up paying exactly what you said. So
and that's why I say, that's why I'm so glad that they allow me to come to Lend. Because even though this is sort of old news, people don't know it. People don't always know it. And they're spending money on things or trying to advocate for things that they really can't get. I agree with you. I like the word individualized education plan because I personally believe every child in school should have an individualized education plan. And I think we're gonna get there. I think what COVID did, now it's gonna take us 15 or 20 years, I'll probably long be dead. But I think we're going to get to a place because we now have Zoom, we now have digitized books, we now have online learning, we now have all this. I think eventually every child in this country will get an individualized education plan that will address their difficulties. And I think it will be a wonderful world. I'm sure there'll be negatives that come with that. I can't see them right now, but I think that that will be wonderful. So that's where I like the individualized education, but I think every student, I have a granddaughter who's 8 who has no learning issues. She's doing fine in school, but yet she's really struggling to understand multiplication. If somebody had just spent a couple hours working on her a little bit more with that multiplication, she'd probably achieve it. And that's what I think the future of individualized plans will be. Great. Well, I've already talked about this a little bit. You know, I've talked about how politics influences education. You may be familiar with the 10th Amendment. You know, it says that, you know, we can't make any kind of nationalized curriculum. But you know what really started No Child Left Behind? were these standardized tests that we were giving kids in high school, their math and their science scores. The United States was falling out of the top 20 of all countries throughout the world. All these other countries were performing better than us on these standardized measures. And I firmly believe that the reason of that was because they had national curriculums. So even though children in England might have moved 6 or 7 times, every class was taught through the national curriculum. And so they used the same materials, the same books, the same kinds of criteria to educate them in reading and writing and science and math. I believe that having more of a nationalized umbrella for education could help children, especially children like in Cincinnati Public School, where way more than 60% of the children come from impoverished families, who come from families who have difficulty making ends meet, not just educationally, but food, housing, those sorts of things. And if we had a national curriculum where the educators in Cincinnati Public School didn't have to address all of those things, but could look at a nationalized curriculum of where everybody was taught reading in a certain methodology, instead of reading taught in Cincinnati Public School doesn't really start until about midway through first grade reading instruction, formalized reading instruction. Where my grandchildren go to school, which is the Sycamore School District, it's more of an elite school district. There, my granddaughter, who's 5, just started kindergarten, and she's already getting reading instruction that they would have not gotten in Cincinnati Public Schools until midway through the first grade. This is my opinion, that a nationalized education program would be very helpful. In today's polarized society, where we can't agree on much of anything, it's not going to happen. But I personally think that some idea like that could be beneficial in helping, especially children who come from impoverished neighborhoods or lower socioeconomic neighborhoods. In 2001, though, bipartisan, I want to let you know this, the Republicans and the Democrats agreed that we should put these tests into place, and no child should graduate from high school without passing the high school graduation test. They felt that was important. Instead of addressing the underlying problem of equity among the school districts, of addressing how education was taught throughout this country, they said, we're just going to penalize these children. If they can't pass the graduation test, then they're going to be retained. It went even farther than that, and it said all students will master reading, science, and math curriculums by the 8th grade, or they won't be able to graduate from high school. I mean, that's even before they get into high school. No Child Left Behind. Whoever came up with that name was an absolute genius. The law itself sucked, but the genius of naming it, because who wants to be against No Child Left Behind? I mean, who does that? When I used to tell people, I'm totally against that, they'd say, what's wrong with you? This is why I was against it. This was a 1 or 2 time test that was put into place to say, is your teacher going to be able to keep working? Is your school going to stay open? Are you going to be able to graduate from high school? Anybody here who had to take those high school graduation tests? Ah, yeah, there are people here that had to take them. No Child Left Behind put those proficiency tests in place. I love this cartoon. To be fair, everybody has to take the same test. So everybody climb that tree. To me, this comic tells exactly what No Child Left Behind did. The elephant's gonna fail, right? Fish, what's the fish gonna do? If the only way you can pass the test is to climb the tree. This is what was wrong with No Child Left Behind. It set one standard, and we know that we're equal, but we're not all equal in the way that we demonstrate how we learn. No Child Left Behind and ideas started battling each other. When President Obama was elected, he decided to sort of moderate this No Child Left Behind. So many kids were not graduating. The dropout rate in this country was becoming a real problem because kids were dropping out before they took the graduation test or after they took it because they couldn't graduate. Our numbers were dismal. So what President Obama did was he said, let's go back to what we had sort of in the 60s, to where we will have like, two tiers of education. So we'll have one group of students who maybe want to pursue a college education and may need to demonstrate learning through these individualized tests. But there'll be other students who may want to go into other disciplines that don't require you to take tests and to go get maybe a college degree. So he put in this two-tiered system that thought will race to the top by allowing students to define how they want to pursue their education system. As you might guess, there's a lot of controversy with that kind of thing. So he backed down a little bit on that and he said, let's do this. We can't put in a national curriculum, but he invited 2 education people from every state in the country to come to Washington. And for almost 2 years, they beat it out. What should a child know in kindergarten? What should a child know in first grade? Would you believe since 1918, that had never been done? We'd never done that on a national level to say, this is what a kid should do in kindergarten. This is what a kid should do. Now, some states had those kind of things, but most did not even have it at the state level. Every individual school district were developing these curriculums in isolation of other school districts. And so what President Obama said was, let's all come together and do this Common Core. Let's all decide in the 50 states of America what a child is expected to learn. This was okay with a lot of people on the other side of the aisle, because then we could put tests in place that actually evaluated what a child was learning. These graduation tests, and those of you who took it can speak to it, oftentimes covered stuff that you hadn't necessarily learned in your education program. If there's no baseline, if there's no objectives for what I'm teaching you today, and I give you a test without giving you that instruction, would I expect you to pass it? I wouldn't, in my opinion. Of course, I'm an educator, not a politician. And you can tell why I'm not a politician. They wouldn't elect me anyway. But the Common Core was put into place. So most of these states came together and they all said, okay, if there's federal funding that goes with the Common Core, we'll either accept the Common Core or not. Now, remember, I told you, our governor in the state of Ohio accepted the Common Core, which came with some financial assistance to say this is how we were going to unify instruction in this state. But he put in that 3rd grade reading guarantee to appease the other side of the aisle that said, wait a minute, we still need those tests. We don't trust schools, we don't trust teachers, we don't trust that students are learning, so we're still going to keep those tests in place. The Common Core standards were something that were agreed on by many of the states, but not all of them. In fact, Texas and Alaska still do not accept the Common Core standards. And there's still a lot of controversy with how the Common Core is implemented. Yes, sure.
Are the schools still funded based on their performance and graduation rates rather than, like, aren't schools, the graduation rates rank highly to how the schools actually get funded in our state, correct? So a lot of schools don't push a vocational or another option for them because they won't get their money, right?
Because they don't get the funds for
So
that.
even if they graduate at the lowest level, they still get that ding for being a school that performed high, right?
Right.
So isn't that not?
And the
right?
same way with the 3rd grade reading guarantee test, all of those kinds of things contribute to the funding mechanism of the state.
Right, so the
Yes.
school's incentive then
Is not to pursue those kinds of things. Yes, yeah. Now, I think you'll see in the Cincinnati area, we're a little bit unique in this state because we have the Oaks program.
Right.
We have several programs that have been put into place for a while. Recently, they've started opening up those programs more to persons with unique needs.
Right, but I would argue the higher functioning, like Sycamore or Forest Hills or those higher schools, do not push their students to go.
That's right. It has to come from an external factor. So,
Correct.
yeah, a lot of families who
Because-
come to me, I'll say, have you considered a
Because
secondary?
the school's not going to bring it to your attention.
You're not, because that's their funding mechanism. You're exactly right. She's gonna be a politician.
Sorry, I'm not.
You should. All right. Any questions about those laws? You understand 504 plans? You understand the difference in them and IEPs? Yeah, you want to stand up and stretch for a minute before we go into the second? Yeah, go ahead. We're going to talk about how you get that IEP. So if we can turn it around a little quickly. Bradley, what does DBP, what do you do?
I'm one of the developmental behavioral pediatric fellows.
Oh, pediatricians, yeah. When I saw DBP, I wasn't sure what that meant.
Right, yeah, no, we love our acronyms.
Yeah, I used to say pediatrics or whatever, yeah.
I keep forgetting you guys. Yeah.
Yeah.
Same time, so your program is just.
You guys have very different school policies here. Yeah. Number of practices.
It wasn't as bad as I was literally just so anxious.
Because they like at least write people just wanted to but it was entirely school. A lot of like major, but I
My hands were so sweaty that I was like shaking and log on to show them.
George, like experience, which is like. Like, I just had like. So there was an expectation that we went to. Privilege background, like never been like such a. Right, like on a waiver, but it would be from like somewhere. I think the judge there, we were allowed.
Yeah.
I think it was like. The law of this law. That was from my area about and she was. Private schools, we wanted to approach tech. Honestly, I'm like. And on paper, well, you're really gonna keep things like, you know, like. Yeah. Yeah. I love that.
And I have my worst fear about my cat. We're gonna like open the door, do something to me, so I'm like.
Yeah.
Okay. In his bedroom.
I'm literally something.
Oh, good.
All right, so I'm gonna start back up. We'll get everybody coming back in.
Sorry, I left the microphone. Take it from your hand.
And you have to like wipe away.
Most everybody's back. Sorry, I know it's a short break, but they give me 2 hours to go through 100 and some years of history. You know? Let's talk a little bit about special education now. So for the most part, I'm going to be talking about how you get an IEP and how you get a special education program. So that's the next objective that we're going to talk about. I do want to let you know that especially in this part of the country, there are a lot of families who choose private schools. Many of the private schools do not use IEPs, but they use something called a service plan. A service plan is different from an IEP. A service plan, in my way of thinking, although there are some goals and objectives that can be reached there, is more aligned to a 504 plan than an IEP. However, service plans can allow the private school to access education supports from the public school that the child is attending. So there may be measurable goals in a service plan. I don't have a lot of time in this presentation to talk about the in-depth things of service plans. But if you are working in a private school, you'll notice that probably most of the students that are getting special needs services or special education services are functioning under a service plan. They may also have a 504 plan. They may also have an IEP with their public school district. They may be bused to their public school district for something, or someone from the public school may come to the private school to help them with speech or to help them with reading. It all depends on the circumstances of the specific private school. But just to let you know, most private schools do that. Children who attend private schools who have a 504 plan, remember, it's a part of the Civil Rights Act. They don't have a choice to not accept children who have 504 plans. This is something that is very important for families to know. If you meet the criteria for attending that private school and you have a 504 plan, you cannot be denied services. That's the Civil Rights Act. That's what we fought so hard for, was to make equal access and opportunity for everyone in the country, not just in the education system. So those children cannot be denied based on having a 504 plan. Private schools, we'll talk a little bit about private schools. If a parent chooses to send a child to a private school, the school district is not required to necessarily provide those services. It's a very complicated system that the private schools and the public schools have together of who's going to choose or not. But according to the Supreme Court, if a parent chooses to send a child to a private school, the public school is not required to provide the services. You'll see that it doesn't always work like that. Ohio is really working hard to try and make sure, especially things like speech therapy is provided in private schools, occupational therapy, physical therapy is trying to be helpful there. But this whole thing with the vouchers, to where children or families are now being given this fund, the $6,000 or $8,000 or $9,000, school districts are less inclined to provide services to children in private schools because the funding is being taken away. There used to be a good kind of push that you could say, you know, I'm sending my kid to private school, you're still getting the money for them to come to public school. And now that the voucher system's in place, I think they've bitten off their nose to spite their face, and it's gonna hurt some of the private schools with the additional supports they may need. Again, that's my opinion, and I appreciate that you allow me to give my opinion here. You may have a different opinion, and I'm willing to listen to it. That's my opinion. You know, charter schools. We have a lot of charter schools here. There's a lot of charter schools in downtown Cincinnati. The Don School, DOHN School, is a really big charter school here. Charter schools are public schools, so they have to honor IEPs. They have to honor 504 plans. Charter schools are public schools, so they follow all the same kinds of laws that public schools do. They just aren't governed by the Board of Education for that area. They have their own, their own board of directors that govern how they're going to implement. I'm going to talk back a little on that again about that whole nationalized curriculum and that Common Core kind of thing. You know, if they are isolating and doing their curriculums differently than the public school in the same area, then if a child transfers from one of those charter schools to a public school, I think we're going to have that same disconnect that we've had all along when we don't have some kind of unified understanding of what's going to be taught in various grade levels. I've seen so many children come from one school where they don't teach multiplication until 3rd grade that will come into another school where they taught multiplication in 2nd grade. And so they miss the entire area being taught multiplication and they remain behind because of that. This is the special education process. We put together this flow chart a bunch of years ago. A bunch of us were working on this to kind of show families and school districts how complicated the special education process was. Many parents would say they thought it was just objective, you know, that they go into a meeting and the school would say, yes, we're going to give them an IEP, or no, we're not going to give them an IEP. There really is a flow chart of how this is done. And this is sort of the way that it works. I hate that banner's up there, that you can't see all of it, but yeah, did you want to say something?
There's someone in the waiting room.
There is. How do I do that? Oh. I just admit them?
Yeah. And then if you click on the three dots.
Oh, you guys are great.
Three dots, and then hide floating meeting. About 2/3.
Hide floating meeting controls? That one? Thank you. Oh, thank you. Now I can see it a little bit better. Thank you very much. I should have asked you that early on. shouldn't I? Yeah. Now you know my weakness. So the Individuals with Disability Education Act, so let's dig down into it now and see how we get it. When I first started working in the field of special education, we took kids that weren't doing well and we tested them. We did these multi-factored assessments, or in Ohio, we call them evaluation team assessments, or ETRs. But we gave them an IQ test, we gave them a test in academics, we gave them a test in speech, and other sorts of tests to decide, did they qualify for one of the 13 or 15 different areas that the federal government has identified as needing special education services. But 10 or 15 years ago, we were looking at that and saying, you know, it costs about $7,000 for a basic education test to be conducted. To do the psychological with the psychologist, to do the education with an educator, to do the speech and language testing, all that kind of stuff costs money. In Cincinnati Public School, it costs about $7,000 to conduct a multi-factored assessment. And they get about, it's just recently gone up. They used to just get $5,000 per student per year allocated to students. So you can see they're already at a deficit. They've raised that now to where it's $8,000 or $9,000 per student. So you can see a multi-factored assessment that's done just randomly on kids could really eat up the entire budget for that child for that school year. And so what happened about 15 years ago was they said, you know, we think that there are many kids who don't necessarily need an IEP, but maybe they come from an environment where they haven't been given the opportunity to learn, and they don't really have a disability, but they just need some time to catch up. And so they put this thing in called RTI, or response to intervention. And what response to intervention did was it said, let's give those children an opportunity. Now it won't switch. Is there a reason why it won't do that now? Do I need to put that back on to make it turn?
No, click, it's on the screen,
The what?
screen bar, if it progresses itself,
There you go. It just lost it, huh?
it might come back.
Okay, thank you, thank you. So this is the RTI model. How many of you have heard of RTI? Yeah, a lot of you have heard of RTI. So the RTI model says, before we rush and spend $6,000, $7,000, $8,000 to do this multi-factored assessment, let's put these children through some of these intervention models to see if they will help them to catch up with their peers. And then by the time we get to the top of the pyramid, if that's not being beneficial, then we need to proceed with that. Now, it's changed a little bit over the years. It used to be that children formally had to go through each of these evaluation or intervention processes to get to testing for an IEP. No longer is it like that. What we've been seeing are some of these interventions are actually interventions that are put in place as a part of an IEP. So children may be evaluated before they go through this intervention process. But just to let you know that it gives an opportunity, and I think it addressed somewhat of what you said, children not waiting to be identified, parents being afraid to identify their children early on, giving them an opportunity to get some intervention supports in the areas that they need help with, may eliminate the need to test them for an IEP, or may, keep them from being identified with an IEP, but giving them the service they need. You know, another thing that's happened in the education system that happened since I was in school, when I was in school as a special, and I became a special education teacher, I had my little rolling cart, which I still carry. My little rolling cart that had all my little tips and tricks in there. It had all the curriculums that I used for kids who had a math disability, or the curriculums that I needed to use for children who had a cognitive impairment or had a reading problem. I had all those kind of tools in there, and I would use those tools. Well, now we have a clearinghouse, which kind of goes with what many of your disciplines have, which is a repository of all the research that tells you, this is what the research says about how to help children with certain kinds of learning deficits. It's called What Works Clearinghouse. It's not a very easy system to navigate, although for you guys, it might not be so hard. It's harder for me. But maybe your school district says, we're going to put your child in reading intervention and we're going to use Orton Gillingham. And you don't know what Orton Gillingham is. You can go on What Works Clearinghouse, type in Orton Gillingham. It will tell you what this methodology is, who it best addresses, what kinds of materials are used. It's a clearinghouse that tells you about the research and the methodologies that are used in the various interventions that happen. Same way in interventions that are used in IEPs. This is the clearinghouse that is used. I admit this person too, I guess. Kind of frustrating, huh? What if you are working with a family who would like to have their child evaluated and maybe they haven't gone through the RTI process? How do you do that? Well, the important thing is for the family to write a note or a letter to the school. I also encourage them to send a copy of the letter to the principal, the teacher, and the superintendent of the school district that they would like to have their child evaluated for a learning disorder or for an IEP. You got to remember though, you've got to provide some evidence of why that is. Because what's going to happen is that they're going to get this letter. If you don't provide the evidence, then these people in charge are going to go back and say to the teacher, how is Johnny doing in there? And the teacher may say, well, he's a little bit behind, but he's catching up, he's working hard. You know how teachers kind of address the personality of the kids along with their learning needs. And so they may not see it as significant as a parent would see it. And so then the school district would come back and say, we don't have any evidence to run your child through this very expensive process. So you have to give that evidence. It's also important if you help parents to write letters to request for evaluations to see how a child is performing, is that you avoid any kind of adversarial language. Sometimes parents will write letters, and I know they're frustrated because their child's not learning well, or their child's frustrated, or their child's having difficulties, and they'll say his teacher is refusing to help him. Well, there's something in the law that says we cannot attack the individuals who are teaching our children. It's an HR policy. It's got nothing to do with education law or civil rights law. It's an HR understanding. So when teachers are hired, they have to be hired based on their credentials that they demonstrate. So if you are saying this teacher doesn't like my child, this teacher won't help my child, you can kind of say that, but don't use that as your language to get evidence for a child to get an IEP, because the school district could be sued by the teacher for putting that kind of thing in place because it's an HR law. Does that make sense? Yeah, I think it's so important. I see letters all the time that you all wonderful people try and help. Doctors oftentimes try to write a letter to the school to say this child needs an IEP. We've asked the teacher and the teacher's not helping, or the parent says, the teacher says. That don't use that kind of language. You are going to harm yourself of being able to get that kind of supports. The other thing I hear people do, and I know that there's some people that teach at Children's Hospital that disagree with me. Most states have a 30-day window of when you write this letter to request an evaluation to be done. The school has 30 days to get back with you to say, yes, we're going to test. No, we're not. Here's what we're going to do. Here are the things we'll put into place. School districts, not just states, school districts interpret that 30 days very differently. Is it 30 school days? Is it 30 calendar days? I say to you, it's better not to push that. There are going to be lots of things you're going to have to push through the special education process. Giving them a reasonable time frame is very important to me. Many school districts have only maybe one psychologist or one diagnostic educator, and they may not be able to get to you in that 30-day window. Now, if they're waiting 60, 90 days, or you're being pushed off for a whole year, definitely you need to throw around your weight. But most schools will do this in a reasonable time frame, and I encourage you to allow them to work through their process. Most of the time, while they're working through that process, they'll also give you intervention services. As long as, you know, we're giving honey to the problem and not vinegar, pouring vinegar or fire on it. As I talked about, each state does something different with their evaluation. Some do multi-factored evaluations or call them multi-factor evaluations. Some call them evaluation team reports. That's what Ohio does. Kentucky does MFEs. But they all consist of cognitive testing, speech and language testing, and academic testing. They may also be occupational therapy, physical therapy, maybe mental health, a mental health professional. Those kind of things can be added as needed, but that's what the evaluation team does. They put together, they do this evaluation, and they decide if a child qualifies for one of those areas of disabilities. I'm an independent education evaluator since I've left Children's. I do this independently. School districts who refuse to evaluate a child, parents can come to me and I can do the multi-factored evaluation for them. If the school district does an incomplete evaluation, maybe they just check a couple of things, but they don't do the cognitive or the academic or the speech and language. If they do it incompletely, then that family can come and have an independent evaluation. Or if the family disagrees with the conclusions that were put there, they can then seek an independent evaluation. The school district is not required to pay for that independent evaluation unless the determination after that has happened, the child then qualifies for something that they did not qualify for before. I'll say 50-50 of whether that's going to happen or not anymore. It used to be more prevalent that I could find things that the schools didn't, but not necessarily. But that's how an independent evaluation takes place. Remember, I told you during all that testing, the children have to meet one of these diagnostic categories. You know, we're going to talk in a couple of weeks. I'm going to come back and we're going to talk about learning disabilities. And so we'll talk specifically about what's in a lot of these diagnostic categories. But these categories are identified by the Federal Register. Now, my friend Bradley here, as a physician, you use the DSM, right? Many of you use the DSM to identify a disability, right? The Federal Register does not identify with the DSM. So you may say in the clinical setting that a child has autism, but unless that multi-factored evaluation shows that they meet the criteria for autism that's in the Federal Register, then they may not get those services, even if you've diagnosed them with that. Does that make sense? Well, it might not make sense, but there are two different diagnostic tools. So you need to become familiar once you get out and into practice of working, what the Federal Register says and how your state that you're working in identifies these disabilities. It will tell you specifically what has to happen for a child to get a learning disability diagnosis, to get an IEP as a child with a learning disability, intellectually handicapped. I say between 13 and 15 different categories. Some states even have 18 categories. It depends on how they pull out blind, deaf, autism. But each state will have a manual that tells you specifically what that child has to do in that multi-factored evaluation to be able to qualify for an IEP there. It's not random. It's not the school district sitting across from a parent saying, I'm not going to give your child an IEP. There is specific criteria. Now, as a consultant myself, a lot of times parents will come to me and say, this is why they said my child didn't get it. Does this align with the criteria in the Federal Register? And I will investigate that for them. But it's pretty clear cut about what a child needs to do to get that disability identification. So let me ask you, does the diagnosis that you give here mean they're going to be eligible for school services? No. All right. It's very important. And I think it's important we as colleagues that work in a clinical setting inform families of that. I think it's important that we tell them, we believe that your child meets the criteria for autism that is set up in the clinical setting. However, your school system may look differently on this, because to get an IEP, there has to be one thing that has to happen. And that child has to have something that adversely affects their educational performance. There are many children with autism who do really well in reading, writing, and math. They may do really poorly in socialization, may have behavior regulation problems. But if they're learning the basics of what education is there for, reading, writing, math, science, and social studies, if they're meeting that criteria, even though they have a diagnosis, they may not get an education. Questions or thoughts? I think it's so important for us to let families understand that. I worked here for 32 years. I know parents leave out of here with our reports and they go to the school and they throw it on the table and they say, give me an IEP. Then they have to hear the news that we look at things in the school system very differently than they look at in a clinical setting. Can you pass that over?
I think that's where the IEP and 504 distinction can be really valuable too, because let's say you have an autism, a person in your care with an autism diagnosis might not be affecting their educational performance, but let's say that they are very uncomfortable walking through the hallways with everyone else. They can get a 504 that says they get to leave class 5 minutes early. Yeah, so that they can find other accommodations to help them, even if it's not.
You are exactly right. That's a wonderful way of putting it. Definitely, that's true. And that's why I think 504 plans are underutilized. People are getting told they don't qualify for an IEP and they don't have enough understanding of the 504 process or the accommodation plans or the behavior plans, which we're not going to talk about so much today, but there's even a behavior plan that can be put into place that has nothing to do with getting an IEP, but can be a separate document and a separate representation. So, yeah.
Just to go back to the 504 piece, I know we were talking about 504s in like the private school setting, they have to be respected. Who determines what is in a 504 plan, what accommodations are in it, who is eligible for it? Because it seems to me that if a school is making that determination, then it would be very easy for them to say, oh, you don't meet criteria for a 504 plan.
Yeah, I will tell you, it's like a lot of things that does happen, but there is an accommodation manual at the state of Ohio. It's 536 pages long. It's a manual that's at the state level that tells you what accommodations are approved by the state. So I always tell families, let's go through there and see what we can identify so we don't get that if we're getting a school district who says that. To get a 504 plan, you have to have documentation of some sort of disability. Usually that comes from the pediatrician. The pediatrician will write a letter and say, this child is in a cast for the next 6 weeks and then in physical therapy for the next 9 weeks and they need a 504 plan. But you're exactly right, but that there are accommodation manuals at the state level and the federal level that have all been approved. And so when you get that kind of thing, that's why it takes someone to be able to understand this education system to get those things in place. She has a comment.
shout that. Sorry, I was gonna shout.
But to follow up on that, though, that's where I think like what you're saying is super important because a lot of parents would get discouraged hearing no. And ultimately, when you're in those meetings, the school is interpreting a lot of those accommodations and they're telling you what they can provide rather than looking at what the books are. So you need to know how to advocate for yourself in those meetings, but you also have to be able to kind of dance with them and make sure that they say, oh, here comes Mrs. Klein and not, oh my God, here comes Mrs. Klein again. You know, so it's, you've got to work with the school because they're a business and they're funded and they only have so many resources. So you can't get blood out of a stone, basically. So it's a dance, but someone like you and explaining that to parents would be helpful because you do kind of come in with this child that's struggling, thinking that you've got all of these opportunities and based on your school district, based on a lot of factors, you might not get them in.
Right. That's right. Or they're just thinking, they're not thinking outside the box, you know, educators
what they
one
have.
way of things,
Correct.
schools have one way of doing things, and they may not even know that I've been to school districts where they didn't even know there was an accommodation manual at the state level.
Right, and it takes a lot to challenge the school, to be honest, as a parent, to challenge because you take what they say and they will interpret it and say, we can't accommodate. So having someone like you or understanding that is huge.
And someone like all of you So all of you in
All
your
of you.
disciplines need to understand those kinds of things. So you can either help find someone like me to advocate, or so you yourself can advocate in your discipline. For, say, you're an occupational therapist and you recognize that this child needs this kind of accommodation in the classroom. My middle grandchild has like this sensory processing thing, and she does so well if she can wear her earmuffs in the classroom, you know? And you wouldn't think that was a big deal, but it was a big deal in her kindergarten classroom. They didn't want her wearing her earmuffs, you know? So we went to an occupational therapist. The occupational therapist wrote, this is what this is gonna do, and sent it to the teacher, and now things are much improved. So the disciplines also need to understand what modifications are commonly accepted and what ones have been approved, so that you can recommend those if the child is being denied service. Did you have a comment?
Yeah, I actually have a question. In your experience, how long does it take a certain school district to implement a 504 plan? Is there any type of requirement as far as like how long schools can take to do this? Yeah.
No, that's a very good question. It's a little different than that 30 days that they have to identify for an IEP. That doesn't mean the IEP will be done in 30 days. That means they have to agree to looking at the data or implementing the testing to look at that. But no, a 504 plan, if you bring it signed by, I usually say it should be by the pediatrician, should send this letter. And don't encourage pediatricians to list the accommodations and modifications. I sometimes see those letters. Just get them qualified. Then let's work from that qualification to the next level of that. But no, there is no time frame on that. But remember, if you've submitted a note from the pediatrician that says this child has this disability and they don't qualify for an IEP and they're dragging their feet on those kind of things, that's when you get a civil rights attorney kind of in the mix, or someone like myself who knows it. But no, there's no specific timeline. But once you get a 504 plan, the great thing is there's no timeline for it to end either. Sometimes schools are getting smart and they're putting a date of beginning and end on accommodation plans or 504 plans, but they don't have to from the federal government. So it can last till they're 99 years of age, if that's like.
And any like capacity?
In any capacity. So actually, I worked with a young man when he was younger, and this tells you how old I am. I should I was working with this young man in first grade, and he was struggling to read, and I diagnosed him with dyslexia. We finally got him through high school. Then he wanted to go to the police academy, and he went to the police academy, and his 504 plan that was put in place there. Because once a child leaves school, the IEP is gone. So it's important to get that 504 plan in place to help them. So he went to the police academy, he got all the accommodations with the 504 plan. Like 5 years went down the road. He was this really great police officer. Well, then he called me up out of nowhere, and you know, he's like 25, 26 years old. And I'm like, how can I help you now? He said, I need accommodations. I want to take the test to become an investigator, a private investigator, but I can't write the notes like they want me to write because I can't spell well. And if I could dictate into something, I could dictate it like I did when I was in school. So I went back, I helped him write the 504 plan. He got the special accommodations where he took his investigator test verbally. They asked him the questions, he answered, he passed with flying colors. I put it in place to where he used a dictaphone to put his notes down. Of course, now, you know, that wouldn't be an issue, but many years ago, that was an issue. And he became a certified investigator. So that's how it can help you long after you leave school. Yeah.
So I've always been under the impression that it was either you were eligible for a 504 or an IEP, but does it ever happen where you could have both? Okay.
Very important distinction. There are only 2 states in the entire country that says you can't have both. You want to guess what they are? Texas.
Alaska.
And Alaska. Texas and Alaska. They put laws in, and that's being fought all the way to the Supreme Court. That's going to go to the Supreme Court soon, I hope. But yes. So for example, you might have a child that's identified with autism and has an IEP, but they also got a concussion playing soccer. So they need a 504 plan for that. Now, many IEPs have a place for accommodations and modifications, so you may not need both of those. But a better example than the maybe the concussion would be a child with autism has an IEP and then they break their writing arm. And so they need a 504 plan to accommodate all the written requirements until they get out of their broken arm cast. So yes, definitely you can have both.
Okay, and follow up. So would it be helpful for like someone who has like a developmental disability to have both because a 504 goes into their adulthood? So that would that help with like transitionary out of school?
There's a transition plan.
Yeah, with the same issue. Yeah, with the same issue.
Yeah, there's a transition plan that's built into IEPs. So, and if we get to that, we'll get to showing you that that's built into the IEP. Used to be that would have been helpful, but not necessarily now. Actually, an IEP for an individual with an intellectual disability is probably comprehensive enough. The only thing that I would say might help them is 18 months before they graduate, if they need a 504 plan, implementing it at that time. But probably they wouldn't need two separate documents.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, because the transition would work for their adult.
They've got an IEP, they already put the accommodations in their IEP.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh,
Do you have a comment?
Yeah, follow up with what she said. So how about what happens after transition? So like when they're like a fully like adult, say they're like, I don't know, like 30 and they're looking for jobs and they need like
504 plan would be very instrumental. If you had anybody off your high school, I could get it. Yes, yes, okay, yes, and you should. And you should. You should, I mean, and that's what frustrates me most secondary about schools. They don't tell you about the Oaks, or they don't make it easy for you to transition to other kinds of education systems. And they don't tell you that before your child leaves, your child should have a 504 plan. But you should, yes, well, you'll still need documentation from a physician that the child has whatever. Yes, yes, and then a 504 plan will be put in place. Yeah.
One other thing, sorry. No, you're good. What else does like a 504 do for an adult with a disability besides help with like work? Like, does it help with any other aspect of their life, or is it usually just for working
It makes sure it
purposes?
equals the playing field.
Mhm.
So if a person wants to vote and has no way of getting to the polling place, the 504 plan would be instrumental in getting them that kind of service. That's one example that we've used frequently during the last election, was getting something in place, going to the Board of Elections and saying this person can't get there. Now that they're requiring everybody to be there and not use some of the other alternative methods, oh boy, I'm digging a hole here, but you know what I mean, you know, laws are being different, but those are some of the things that could happen. Same way, a 504 plan, I think for many people with disabilities that are already in a job are probably not necessary if things are going well. But if you're trying to find a new job or a career or whatever, and Kroger will tell you, Kroger in this area is a really big hire of persons with intellectual disabilities. And most of them do not have a 504 plan, but I just worked with a young man, not even young, a man who worked at Kroger, and he really did well when he carried this little baby kind of with him, you know, to keep with him at all times. It was kind of his security. And so we got him to get a little one and keep it kind of in his pocket, you know. But Kroger was having a little bit of issue with that. People were complaining about that. And so we did institute a 504 plan that said he was going to be able to carry something in his pocket as you know, sort of like a fidget or whatever. So it may be necessary, but not required.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Did somebody else have a comment or, yeah?
If a child gets an IEP or a 504 plan in one school district and then the family moves districts or states, does that automatically follow them, or do they have to get reevaluated?
You get a good question. If they're within the same state, it should transfer from one to the other. However, districts have the opportunity, 45-day window, to reevaluate if they feel that the services that are in that IEP are not appropriate for that child. They have a 45-day window in the state of Ohio. It differs based on other states, but they have 45 days to determine. Many school districts will tell you it takes that long for one IEP to get to the new school. Now, if they go across state lines, there's, depending on the state, they have another time frame period where the state can reconduct the evaluation, but doesn't have to. I think it all depends. I think if you see that a child has identification of an intellectual disability, you won't see that happen quite as often when they pass state lines. But learning disabilities, yes, because the state of Kentucky identifies learning disabilities very different than the state of Ohio. They may require that reevaluation. Good questions, good questions. I am running out of time, so I'm going to speed up just a little bit here. I want to remind you that special education used to be a place. It's not a place anymore. It's one of the many services that children get in special education. And something else that I think parents don't always understand is an IEP doesn't mean that your child's going to read on grade level if they have a reading disorder. It doesn't mean your child's going to graduate from high school if they don't meet the criteria for going through high school. What an IEP has to do is give some educational benefit, some benefit that helps them to learn better or in a different way, but it doesn't guarantee that they're going to read. I have so many families come to me and say, my child has been in special education since the first grade, and he's now in 5th grade, and he's still not reading on grade level. And I have to go back and explain to them, if the child has dyslexia, they're probably never going to read on grade level. And that's a hard thing to talk about, but that's very important for families to hear, that that child may not always read on grade level, but if they put goals in place to help that child and they can prove, the school can prove that their reading has improved, even if it's a minimal amount. We call this the Chevy versus the Cadillac. Schools aren't required to give you a Cadillac. They're only required to give you Chevy services. I'm not going to be able to go through a lot of the IEP because we've just run out of time, but I appreciate your thoughts. You all know that you have my PowerPoint there, and you have my email if you have any questions about it. You know, there are several things that I think are important on the IEP. You have to list where a child is currently performing, and then there has to be goals that help a child to improve. What I think is important about that is recognizing that when we ask parents about the child's present level of performance, they tend to tell us the child is a really nice kid, you know, the child may have trouble making friends, you know, the child is a good kid, or that's not what we need. We need things that are aligned to how that child is performing in the education system. So here's an example. Salima is a sweet, cute girl. She wants to be a doctor or a singer like Beyonce. That's what somebody actually wrote as a present level of performance. That doesn't have diddly squat to do with anything in the education system, all right? So Salima, this is a good one. This is what I helped them write. Salima cannot identify words or comprehend the information from her grade level textbook. She can write letters when she's provided assistance how to spell something, but she's most cooperative at doing that if you give her a lot of positive feedback, and she's easily disorganized and frustrated when she has to do things in front of her peers and they see that she's not doing it the same. That's a good present level of performance. So when you're looking at families, help them to create an elevator speech or a little speech for them so that when they start writing the IEP, they can align it to how education can support them. I'm not going to spend too much more time on that. I am going to tell you there are lots of supports and services that kids can get in schools. Remember, it all has to be aligned to their disability, okay? So it's not random, you know? You may have a child with autism, as I said, and they have no problems in math. They're performing average in math. Well, they're not going to get a math goal, okay? They're not going to get a math support. There are also parts in each of the IEPs that talk about that No Child Left Behind because it's still around. There's still proficiency tests around. There's a 3rd grade reading guarantee. So what you have to tell parents, if they're afraid of the 3rd grade reading guarantee, when they're discussing the IEP, there's a part of the IEP where they can waive that requirement. And depending on what state you're in and what district you're working in, there's different requirements for that. You can see on your website, you can go to these web addresses and you can see what that criteria is, since I've kind of run out of time. Same way with Kentucky. Kentucky has the same kinds of things. I was gonna go through and talk a little bit about what's the difference. I've said accommodations and modifications together many times. What do you think fewer test questions are? Is it an accommodation about how to equal the playing field, or is it a modification, changing how something will be done? What do you think it is? It's a modification, that's right. Preferential seating, is that accommodation? That means you get the chance to sit near the teacher or somewhere close. Is that an accommodation or a modification? It's an accommodation, you're exactly right. Assistive technology. So kids, it's what? Accommodation, very good. What about adjusted grading scale? A modification, oh, you guys are good at this. An alternative project? A modification, very good. Enlarged text? You guys are great about this. Yeah. So that is what you have to keep in mind when you're asking for those kinds of supports in schools. And as I talked about, for students age 14 and higher, in some states it starts at 16. In this area, it starts at 14. There's a formalized transition plan. The state has done a marvelous job of putting together a roadmap for families who need support through transition. I don't know if you all that work with families see that, but I really like their roadmaps. I really think that these materials are very helpful to families understanding transition planning and what needs to be in place. This is the part of the IEP that identifies the transition plan, what kind of supports and services are going to be provided. And I'm sorry I'm rushing through that, but I do want to tell you one more thing. The more that you can understand the language of the Federal Register or the language of the school, the better you're going to be able to get services for the children you work with. Doctors use the word encephalopathy all the time and they can't even define. No offense, but you know, but it's true. They can't define. Don't use medical terms. If you're in a profession that throws around a lot of abbreviations, don't use them when you're talking with teachers. We don't know what they are, okay? And we can't help you find a support if we don't know what it is. Describe what's happening. Separate people from the problem. Remember where I said HR is live and well in the education system. You can't address a teacher in a way that you couldn't address another employee in another position. Avoid threats, avoid timeline demands. Keep your requests focused on how they're going to learn better, on reading, writing, and math. Focus on their needs and not their emotions. That's so hard for families. They're already dealing with complex medical needs, social emotional needs, you know, financial difficulties. But when you are working with the schools, focus on academics, all right? Because you will see that teachers become more disengaged when you're talking about the other kinds of things, because that's not what they're trained to deal with. I know we think teachers are trained to deal with everything, but they're really not. And so focus on those kinds of things. And then use that What Works Clearinghouse to find strategies. I always tell families, before you go into a meeting, I'm giving you 3 strategies that this child might benefit from that could be included in their IEP. Look up those things beforehand so that if the school says, we don't know what to do to help them, we've tried this, have something in your back pocket to say, have you thought about this? They do appreciate that. You know, if you dispute an IEP, you don't want the IEP, you do want the IEP, there are 2 processes called mediation and due process. Again, I've run out of time, so I can't go through them, but there's a wonderful spreadsheet that tells you what the difference is and how you can appeal decisions that are made by schools that you don't agree with if you're the family. And it stopped turning again. There are specific manuals that are given to families so that this walks them through everything we walk through, but they're like 50, 60 pages. So that's why I'm giving you the 2-hour thing of what's involved in these handbooks that, depending on whether you're in Ohio or Kentucky or Indiana, these are the kinds of things you need. And then finally, I just want to real briefly talk about clinical and education. As I said, in the clinical field, you use the DSM oftentimes. In the education field, we use IDEA and the Federal Register. The more that you can know a little bit about the Federal Register, the better you're going to be able to advocate and help kids that are needing specific things. Remember, diagnosis-driven versus eligibility-driven are 2 very different roles that you need to take there. I like to say that in special education, we really are a team. You know, we're the dream team. We try and put all of you all together to try and make that happen. But as you can imagine, that's a lot of people to get on the same page. And so the more that we can understand the law, the more that we can understand the regulations, what are accommodations, what are modifications, I think the better we'll be able to put things together to help these children. I thank you very much for your time and attention. I always have too much, but I hope it gave you an introduction to special education or maybe reinforce some of the things you already knew about it. This should be on your portal so that you should be able to do that. And as I said, you know, if you need any questions or have any questions or whatever, stick around for a few minutes and please fill out the evaluation. They told me to remind you about that. And I'll stick around if there's any questions or comments, but I know you might need a little break before your 3 o'clock. Thank you. Thank you.